Welcome to Network Security. This is the first lecture of the course. The whole course has been divided into 5 units, and each one of those will take us through different aspects of network security. You can view the topics covered by Unit 1 on the screen. A brief introduction to network security has been already made available to you in the introductory lecture. So, in this lecture, we will discuss security architecture, which will further lead us to security attacks, secure network services, and security mechanisms. Now, based upon the concerns discussed in the introductory lecture, we can say that there is no absolute definition of a secure network. And because no absolute definition of a secure network exists, what do you think should be the first step that you and I, or an organization, or anyone should take towards achieving security? The first thing to do is to identify what exactly do we want to protect. Before we could think about the ways of achieving protection, before we could think how to protect things, it is necessary that we identify the things that are important to us. We identify the things that we want to protect. And that is why a security policy is defined. A security policy does not specify how to achieve protection. Instead, it clearly states the items that are to be protected. And what happens most of the times is that security policies end up being complex because the reason behind their complexities is that we humans define them. And naturally, when human behavior has to be related to network and computer security, complexities do occur. So the people who are responsible for providing security, they need a systematic way of defining the requirements, and then they should systematically define the approaches that must be followed to satisfy those requirements. And for that, we need a security architecture. So, a security architecture is a systematic approach through which we define the requirements and then define the approaches to meet those requirements. And luckily, ITUT developed a standard which is X800. This standard is known as Security Architecture for OSI. By the way, ITU is International Telecommunication Union. This is a United Nations sponsored agency that develops standards related to telecommunication and OSI. And this International Telecommunications Union has a sector known as Telecommunications Standardization Sector. This sector is fully devoted to the research and establishment of standards for telecommunication. And this telecommunication standardization sector has developed the X800 standard. Now, this OSI security architecture, it focuses on three things: security attacks, security services, and security mechanisms. Now, what is a security attack? Or to be more precise, what is an information security attack? Any action, any attempt, of course, a deliberate one. Attacks are always deliberate. So, any deliberate action that violates or compromises the security of information is an information security attack. And to protect data against attacks, naturally a procedure, a technique has to be followed. And that technique is a security mechanism. And now security services. Security services and security mechanisms are closely related. A mechanism or a combination of mechanisms are used to provide a security service, or a single mechanism can also be used to provide more than one services. Now, before moving into the details of these concepts, I would like to briefly explain some security goals to you. These security goals are actually some aspects of security, some aspects of data security, which organizations usually consider to be most important. And these are confidentiality of information, integrity of information, and availability of information. Confidentiality. Confidentiality is protection against unauthorized access. Only the intended users should access the information. For example, in banking, customer accounts need to be kept secret. You would not like to disclose your grades to everyone. Your teachers do not show the question papers to everyone before examinations. And confidentiality not only applies to the storage of information, it also applies to the transmission. Information should remain confidential while it's being stored, and it should remain confidential while it's being transmitted. Integrity. Integrity is protection from unauthorized change. It refers to the originality of information. Is the data that arrives at a receiver exactly the same as the data that was sent? You would never like anyone to hear ABC when what you said was DEF. And then we have availability. Availability is accessibility of data for legitimate users, for valid users. See, information is useless if it's not available when needed. And unavailability of information is just as harmful for an organization as the lack of confidentiality or integrity. So, availability refers to protection of data against disruption of services. Now, security attacks. Let's come to know about different types of security attacks in context to security goals. So among the different categories of security attacks, we have the first category of attacks that threatens the confidentiality of information. The second category threatens the integrity, and the third category threatens the availability. Now, snooping. Snooping is actually unauthorized interception of data, unauthorized access to data. For example, you transfer a file through internet and it may contain some confidential information. An unauthorized entity may intercept the transmission and use the contents for his or her own benefit. Or for example, you're talking to someone over phone and somebody is eavesdropping over the conversation. That is snooping. Traffic analysis. And the opponent sometimes observes the pattern of the messages. The op observes the way we send information, and he can also determine the location and identity of those who are involved in communication. And this information gathered by the opponent then proves to be useful in guessing the nature of communication that was taking place, or it can benefit the opponent in other ways. That is traffic analysis, monitoring the traffic. Then from the second category of attacks, we have modification. See, in modification, the attacker, after capturing the information, modifies it to make it beneficial to himself. Or simply a part of the actual message is altered or delayed to produce an unauthorized effect. For example, a message that reads, "Allow Mr. A to read the file X." This can be modified to mean, "Allow Mr. B to read the file X." Here Mr. B can be the attacker and he can benefit himself by reading the contents of the file X. Another type of attack is masquerading. Masquerading happens when the attacker impersonates someone. For example, a customer tries to contact the bank, but another side pretends to be the bank and obtains information from the user. That is masquerading. The attacker actually wears a mask of someone or something that is valid or legitimate. Replay. Replay is simply capturing of data and then subsequently retransmitting it. As you can see that A sends some information to B and the attacker captures this information and then later on retransmits this information to B to benefit himself. And the last one from the second category is repudiation. In repudiation, the sender of information can later on deny that he didn't send any information. And similarly, the receiver can also deny the reception of information. Then from the third category of attacks, we have denial of service attack. This attack may slow down or totally disrupt the services of the system. And disruption of services can be achieved through many strategies. For example, an attacker can send too many requests to the server that the server crashes due to heavy load. Or an attacker might intercept and delete a server's response to a client, making the client believe that the server is not responding to him. So, one way or the other way, a valid user is denied of the services, and that's why we call it as denial of service attack. Now, attacks can also be categorized as passive and active attacks. In a passive attack, the attacker's goal is to obtain information. So, passive attacks do not modify data or harm the system. In fact, the system continues with its normal operation. Although the disclosure of information to the attacker may harm the sender or the receiver, but the system is not affected. And because passive attacks are actually difficult to detect when compared to active attacks, because passive attacks do not involve any alteration of data or they do not harm the system. And then active attacks. Active attacks involve modification of data or creation of false data. Uh, so, snooping and traffic analysis can be categorized under passive attacks. Modification, masquerading, replay, repudiation, and denial of service attacks can be categorized under active attacks. Security services. Security service is a communication service that is provided by a system to give a specific kind of protection to system resources. And can be broadly divided into 5 categories: authentication service, access control, data confidentiality, integrity, and non repudiation. Authentication. Authentication is the assurance that the communicating entity is the one that it claims to be. This service has two aspects. The first one is peer entity authentication, and the second one is data origin authentication. Peer entity authentication service provides authentication of the sender or receiver during connection establishment. This is usually done for connection oriented communication. And the second aspect is this is for connectionless transfers. It provides the assurance that the source of received data is as claimed. Access control. Access control is prevention of unauthorized use of a resource. This service controls who can have access to a resource, under what conditions access to resource can occur, and those accessing the resource, what can they be allowed to do. Data confidentiality. This service assures protection of data from unauthorized access. It ensures the confidentiality of the whole message or part of the message, and also protection against traffic analysis. Data integrity. This service ensures that data received are exactly as sent by an authorized entity. That is, no modification, insertion, deletion, or replay should take place. Non-repudiation. Non-repudiation service provides protection against denial, against repudiation by one of the entities involved in communication. The sender or the receiver of information should not later on deny the sending or reception of information. The non-repudiation service has also two aspects: non-repudiation with proof of origin and non-repudiation with proof of delivery. In non-repudiation with proof of origin, the receiver of data can later on prove the identity of the sender in case the sender denies. And in non-repudiation with proof of delivery, the sender can later on prove the identity of receiver in case the receiver denies. And security mechanisms. Mechanisms, as already mentioned, are actually the techniques with which we implement security services. And in security mechanisms, we have encipherment, data integrity, digital signature, authentication exchange, traffic padding, routing control, notarization, and access control. Encipherment. Encipherment is hiding or covering of data. In encipherment, data is actually transformed into a form that's not readily interpretable. And even if an attacker intercepts the information, he should not be able to interpret it. So we kind of encode the information into a form not everyone can interpret. And encipherment involves use of mathematical algorithms. Data integrity. In this mechanism, a short check value is appended to the information. And this check value is actually created from the information itself, from the data itself. And upon receiving the information and the check value, the receiver creates a new check value from the received information. If the newly created check value and the one which was sent by the sender match each other, then the integrity of the data is preserved. Digital signature. In digital signature mechanism, the sender electronically signs the data and receiver can electronically verify the signature. And this mechanism enforces authenticity of data as well as that of the sender. Authentication exchange. In authentication exchange, two entities exchange some information to prove their identity to each other. For example, if Mr. A and Mr. B want to communicate and they want to be sure that they actually are Mr. A and B, they can prove their identities to each other by exchanging some information only they are supposed to know. That is authentication exchange. Entities exchange some confidential information to prove their identities to each other. Traffic padding. In traffic padding, some insignificant information is inserted into the data traffic just to frustrate any traffic analysis attempts. Routing control. Routing control enables selection of a physically secure route and also changing of routes when a security breach is suspected. Notarization. Notarization is simply selecting a trusted third party to control the communication. Notarization can be done to prevent repudiation. And the last one is access control. Access control ensures that users only access those resources and services that they are entitled to access. So, in access control, the individual trying to gain access must first be identified and then authorized or authenticated, and then access rights are tailored to the individual.